Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the kickoff event in the 2020 OSHA webinar series. It's become an annual tradition now that in January we get together the partners in Conn Maciel Carey's OSHA practice and take a look back at the year that has passed and take stock of what we've learned about OSHA over the course of the previous year, over the course of 2019 in this instance, and look ahead to a little bit of what we learned from 2019 might forecast, might foretell for the upcoming year, now 2020. So that's what we'll be spending part of the time doing today. We've got 2 years worth of OSHA information to cover, and as you may have experienced if you've joined us over the last few years of this webinar series, we rarely land this plane on time. So with all the content we have, I'm going to jump right in, introduce myself, and then have my colleagues introduce themselves real briefly as they take over their portion of the program today. The first faceless voice you're hearing from, this is Eric Conn. I'm the chair of Conn Maciel Carey's OSHA practice, and I'm sort of scared to report that now I've been doing this for 20 years as of 2020, practicing more or less exclusively in the field of workplace safety and health, after practicing the first decade of my career alongside the first general counsel of the OSHA Review Commission. My practice focuses exclusively on workplace safety and health matters from a soup to nuts standpoint, proactive advice and counsel, develop programs, audit, etc., but also maybe primarily on the enforcement side, helping employers manage inspections and investigations involving OSHA, state OSHA plans, and other worker safety related agencies, and the full range of litigation involving OSHA disputes. Our agenda today, as I said, it's a look back at OSHA over the course of 2019 and a forecast for the top issues to look out for from OSHA in 2020, and we've broken it down into 3 major buckets. The first is organizational updates, and it's principally organizational updates involving OSHA, but there are a couple of other related agency updates to report as well, including a new Secretary of Labor and some big changes at the OSHA Review Commission. The second bucket is the enforcement landscape. What did we learn about OSHA enforcement in 2019, and what can we expect in 2020? And then finally, on the rulemaking and rule rescinding side of things at OSHA, what can we expect? What did we learn from 2019, and what can we expect in 2020? And I believe my partner Amanda Walker is going to lead us off with the organizational updates.
Hi. My name is Amanda Walker, and my practice is very similar to Eric's. I got my start with OSHA at the agency, so it's always kind of fun to see how the organization stacks up today. Under the Bush administration, actually, I'm trying to figure out how the controls. Oh, here we go. One thing that I think we're surprised to report this year is there is still no Assistant Secretary for OSHA. This is, I think, the first time that OSHA in a presidential term, 4 years, has not had a confirmed Assistant Secretary for OSHA. There's certainly been periods of time where maybe up to a year there hasn't been a confirmed Assistant Secretary, but this is the first time that we're likely to see a presidential term go without an Assistant Secretary, Senate confirmed Assistant Secretary. And this time last year, there was a individual in the wings waiting to be confirmed, actually had gone through the confirmation process twice, had 1 hearing and made it out of committee 2 times, and was waiting for a floor vote, which unfortunately did not happen anytime soon, and he ultimately withdrew his nomination in the early spring, May-ish time frame. He, no fault of his own. I think that it just had to do with a lot of the confirmations, non-judge confirmations being held up by the Senate. The Senate wasn't spending time on them. They were allocating their time on other issues, and particularly getting judges confirmed. And so he withdrew in March of 2019. And at this point, there has not been anyone who has been nominated for the position. So that nomination continues to be vacant. So at this point, it's unlikely, since we're heading into a presidential election year, to see a nominee come up for the OSHA spot, not likely to be nominated. And as I mentioned before, the first time that OSHA is going to go without a Senate-approved assistant secretary. There has been a deputy assistant secretary who's been acting as the assistant secretary. However, there is a requirement under a law called the Vacancies Act that only lets her act in the confirmed spot for a period of time, and she's exceeded that time, so she is officially doing all the duties, but does not have the title of acting assistant secretary, and that is Lauren Sweat. She's been in the administration since the summer of 2017. Not only has there been a vacancy with regards to the assistant secretary, there's also been other personnel issues at OSHA. There's lots of vacancies. One of the reasons is that they've been waiting for an assistant secretary to come in and make some high-level opinions or decisions with regards to staffing, and that person hasn't arrived. So these vacancies have remained in existence. There's been no career deputy assistant secretary since mid-2017-18 when Dorothy Doherty left. We've also not seen a chief of staff or a special assistant. Those are folks that usually come in with the administration or are appointed by the president. So we currently have 2 politicals at OSHA, which is a low number. Usually there's at least 3 or 4. In addition, the career ranks, not only is it the Deputy Assistant Secretary career-wise, who vacancy, there's also regional administrators. I think there's like 6 or 7 regional administrators. A little under half of all the senior staff at OSHA is in an acting position. The Director of Enforcement and other director heads, particularly the Training Institute, are all in acting positions, and they're also seeing a lot of vacancies within area directors. Folks are rotating through most of these career positions in an acting capacity, so someone is filling them or they're traveling or accepting more responsibilities, like out west. They're taking on another region. Some of this is changing, especially with co-shows. There was a hiring freeze when the Trump administration came into place, and that was in place for a period of time, and then it was specifically allowed to be lifted with regards to OSHA and co-shows, and they've been in the process of hiring, but with attrition coupled with the delay and the slowness with hiring, there's the fewest number of co-shows in OSHA history right now, significantly lower than what we saw under the beginning of the Obama administration, probably several hundred lower. That might be some of the reasons, sometimes confused or puzzled by some of the reports that we have to call in with regards to amputations that are now seeing paperwork, a rapid response investigation rather than an actual inspection. And one of the main reasons could be the short number or the low number of co-shows in the field currently. The new Secretary of Labor, this is one new detail that we did not expect to be sharing right now. The prior Secretary of Labor was Alex Acosta. He resigned over the summer, I believe it was July, due to some issues regarding his time as Assistant U.S. Attorney in Florida, and promptly within days, President Trump had nominated Eugene Scalia, who is Justice Scalia's son. He had been in private practice, a labor and employment attorney in Washington, D.C. He was confirmed. He had a pretty fast confirmation process and was confirmed on September 30th, 2019 as the new Secretary of Labor on a straight party line vote in the Senate. He was formerly acting Solicitor of Labor, so the building is not a mystery to him. He was there at the beginning part of the George W. Bush administration, and he was currently waiting to be confirmed, but was not able to get enough votes in the Democrat-controlled Senate in the early 2000s. So he eventually went back to private practice, so this is his second time in the Francis Perkins building, this time as the Secretary of Labor. He's known for challenging federal regulations and has had a pretty good track record with it. All areas, just not OSHA, fiduciary rule, the tip rule, pool rule, and also some OSHA cases that we'll discuss in a moment. Democrats typically opposed his confirmation, as you can tell by the straight party line vote. Going to the next slide. His certainly no stranger to OSHA. He was involved in several significant OSHA cases, including the SeaWorld case when a trainer was killed by one of the whales that she was working with down in Florida. He took that case on appeal and was not successful. It was a general duty cause case. He was more successful with regards to challenging the ergonomics rule that came out at the end of the Clinton administration, and then also has been involved in some other significant litigation with regards to when OSHA has to go through rulemaking that was focusing on the high injury and illness rate targeting and some of the criteria or obligations that OSHA was trying to put on employers who did fit into that category. Going on to the next slide. With regards to OSHA, at the start of 2019, we had a full quorum, three commissioners and one chairwoman, Heather McDougall. This is the adjudicatory board that hears all of the OSHA cases. All three of the commissioners are appointed. Typically, the commissioner or the president, the party of the presidency in control gets 2 of the seats, and then the party out of control or out of the White House gets 1 seat. That's what it looked like in 2019. That quickly changed in the new year, where we saw so at the end of 2019, we had a single commissioner. Heather, the chairwoman, decided to resign to take a position in private practice, and then James Sullivan came on board, or he was still there, but he was the last individual of the 3 still remaining who were in place in 2020. And he was not able to hear any cases. No quorum, so he wasn't able to accept cases or issue any opinions towards the end of 2019. No ability to decide cases. The backlog for OSHA cases or cases on review by the commissioners was starting to build up again, and was starting to strategically deny review on cases so they could go directly to the Federal Court of Appeals. Going to the next slide. Now that we're in 2020, very early in the year, and we're back to a full quorum. Mid-year last year, there were several appointments and a reappointment. James Sullivan is now the chairman, and Cynthia Atwood, who has served 2 terms on the commission, is still there and was reappointed and just recently reconfirmed by the Senate, so she'll be serving another term, as well as a new commissioner, Amanda Liho, who comes from the House, as well as some experience within the National Association of Manufacturers as a Deputy General Counsel for the Senate Homeland Security, for Director of Employment, Labor and Employment Policy. These 2 individuals were nominated late last year. They had their hearings, and then they were confirmed by the Senate as recent as January 9th. So we're back to a full quorum with the commission and expect that they will start now reviewing cases, and we should see some action there shortly. Turning it back over to Eric for the OSHA enforcement portion.
So one of the interesting things, if you've listened in on our January program the last couple of years, we've talked a lot about the enforcement expectations under a Trump administration, and the expectations have generally lined up with what we've seen in past transitions from Democratic administrations to Republican administrations, where you see this reprioritization of compliance assistance over enforcement, or just a general relaxing of an enforcement-heavy philosophy that we had just experienced during a Democratic administration. And certainly there was no reason to expect anything different. Watching President Trump out on the campaign trail before the election, talking about deregulation, talking about eliminating the administrative state, getting the government out of our workplaces and out of our hair. So there was certainly an expectation that perhaps there'd be even more of a scaling back of enforcement during a Trump administration than we've seen in even other prior Republican administrations. And so with that, we expected to see, or the way that they would execute that, or the way typically that OSHA has scaled back enforcement in years and administrations past, have been things like amending enforcement policies, like how you calculate penalties, like how you determine something is a repeat or willful violation, like policies that would call for an automatic increase in the maximum civil penalties every year. You'd see those kinds of changes that would have an impact on individual enforcement actions and overall enforcement actions. Another major area where you tend to see a pendulum swing as you move from one party's administration to another is in the how proactive the agency is in targeting subjects for enforcement, either in individual companies, industries, or particular hazards. And they do that with these national, regional, and local emphasis programs. And one of the things that you tend to see as a trend is many, many fewer of those emphasis programs during a Republican administration than during a Democratic administration. And that was, certainly true from the transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. You would see, a couple of dozen local and regional emphasis programs all across the country, and, a small handful, 3 to 5 national emphasis programs. On the last day of the Obama administration, I believe there was 9 national emphasis programs and about 150 regional and local emphasis programs. So the expectations is surely that many of those will be archived or retired, and will go back to a more reactive stance, waiting for incidents and employee complaints to execute the enforcement arm of the agency. Likewise, we had seen a very purposeful strategy by the Obama administration to pursue more and more worker safety criminal cases. And they did that with the implementation of these 2 memos from the Department of Justice that said, we're going to target more worker safety crimes, and here's how we're going to do it. And I think Kate will talk about that later in this presentation. And we're going to, try to avoid corporate settlements, corporate resolutions in criminal cases, and go after individuals. We surely expected to see some scaling back of that as we transition to the Trump administration, less of a focus perhaps on worker safety criminal cases. And then, one of the, hallmarks for how you scale back a bureaucratic agency, scale back the enforcement arm of a bureaucratic agency in particular, is usually in the budget process, either significant budget cuts to the agency overall or a realignment of the agency's budget to reallocate money from the enforcement arm to other programs like compliance assistance, cooperative programs, grants, some things like that. And certainly the way that President Trump campaigned, we would have expected, or we did, and we have announced our expectations about that now for 3 years. And then the last way that you impact enforcement is in the rulemaking process, rolling back standards, repealing standards, narrowing standards, or just stopping the promulgation of new standards, and that was an expectation that we had and have shared over the last several years. But the reality has been quite a bit different in this administration, and really quite a bit different as it relates to OSHA in this administration. If you look at other agencies like EPA and other enforcement agencies, the expectations perhaps have been met or have been met and then some. But if you're looking just at OSHA, the answer is quite different. We're seeing enforcement inspections increase. We're seeing significant cases, those with $100,000 and $1 million penalties, increase. We're seeing a sustained focus on worker safety criminal cases. We're seeing enforcement generally kind of doing the opposite of what we would have expected in a transition to the Trump administration. One of the reasons, probably the main reason, is what Amanda just spent the last few minutes talking about, is that we have not seen a big influx of political appointees at OSHA. To be 3 years into an administration and still to not have a head of the agency, somebody handpicked by the president to come in and execute the president's agenda, we've never seen it before. This is the longest vacancy, and we're seeing a peculiar enforcement strategy and for enforcement philosophy at OSHA for a Republican administration, and I think those two things cannot be disconnected. So that's probably why. But let's get into some of the detail about what we've seen. Expecting budget cuts at OSHA or expecting a reallocation of budget monies from enforcement to other programs, we've not seen it. We've seen exactly the opposite. On December 20th, less than a month ago, or a little more than a month ago, we saw a new budget, or at least a budget resolution by Congress, signed by the President, to avoid another shutdown. But in this budget, like the budget for fiscal year 2019, we saw a significant increase in OSHA's budget, and a significant increase in OSHA's enforcement budget in particular. It was, I think, a 4% increase in OSHA's budget over fiscal year 2019, for now a total of a 6% budget increase over OSHA's final budget during the Obama administration, fiscal year 18, $33 million more than the agency had in fiscal year 18. So we're up to $582 million budget for OSHA, in exactly the same percentage apportionment to enforcement as we saw in those final Obama year budgets. So, we're not seeing the big cuts that you might see strategically from a Republican administration to influence the ability of the agency to enforce. In fact, we're seeing the opposite. What about the emphasis programs? We expected to see, these 150 local and regional emphasis programs scaled back, and the 9 national emphasis programs scaled back. Well, if you look at OSHA's website today for what the active emphasis programs look like, you will find virtually the exact same number of local and regional emphasis programs and the exact same number of national emphasis programs, which includes even the launch of a new national emphasis program during this administration, the Chemical Facilities and Petroleum Refining Combo Process Safety Management National Emphasis Program. And in addition to those proactive targeting emphasis programs, we also saw OSHA relaunch its site-specific targeting program during this administration, and it had taken a little hiatus when OSHA stopped its injury survey as it rolled out the electronic record-keeping rule. But OSHA, went ahead with restarting the site-specific targeting program after the e-record-keeping rule was put into place, and the agency collected the first year of data under that rule. And using that data, OSHA is underway now, actually underway for a little over a year now, carrying out active enforcement inspections targeting entities based on the data that was collected during the electronic record-keeping rule. And they're targeting employers with DART rates, days away, restricted and transfer injury rates above their industry's average, as well as some below their industry's average, to catch those who they think might be gaming their numbers a little bit. So if they're targeting those with higher than average rates and lower than average rates, it's really impossible to say, we're safe, we're off the list, we don't have to worry about a proactive visit from OSHA, because everything over and everything under is everything and everybody. So there's a chance that if you have participated in the e-record keeping rule, or if you were required to, because they're also targeting those that they believed who should have been submitting data and didn't. But if you're covered by the e-record keeping rule, there is some chance that you are on the SST list and will be subject to an inspection. And there have been more than 1,000 SST inspections conducted already at this point, and those inspections are extremely comprehensive. I mean, they wall-to-wall, every topic you can imagine relevant to your industry. So it's a tough inspection, and this is a big, important inspection program, sort of the granddaddy of them all, of OSHA's programmed inspection programs. So look out for that, the continuation of site-specific targeting in 2020. Penalties keep rising. There was, back in 2016, for the first time in many, many years, as a result of a deal with Congress and the White House to avoid, 5 shutdowns ago, to avoid that shutdown, that resulted in OSHA implementing just about an 80% one-time catch-up penalty increase, and it was to catch up for all the years of increase in the consumer price index since the last time OSHA had raised its penalties. And so what we had seen for many years was maximum penalties for other than serious and serious violations of $7,000, and maximum penalties for willful and repeat violations of $70,000, jumped up to almost $13,000 back in 2016. That deal back in 2016 also implemented an automatic annual increase in OSHA's civil penalty authority to keep up with increases in the consumer price index each year. And one of the things that I expected was when you had Republican control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, which we had in the first year of the Trump administration, that this automatic annual increase would be revisited, or at least someone would even introduce a bill to revisit that, and that did not happen. So we continue to see those annual increases, and we just saw one about a week ago, January 15th, the annual bump of 1.8%, a 1.8% increase in the consumer price index. The urban basket CPI version went up about 1.8% between 2019 and 2012, or actually 2018 and 2019, and that last increase was used to calculate the increase in OSHA's penalties, and here they are now, about 13,500 for other than serious and serious violations, and about $135,000 now for willful and repeat violations. So, if you expected that penalty authority, some of those policies that OSHA implements to affect how significant their enforcement arm is, not only are we not seeing any scaling back or not even seeing a plateau for that, we're continuing to see annual increases during the Trump administration. What about inspections? One of the things that we saw in the really over the course of the Obama administration, the first 2 years of the Obama administration, OSHA ratcheted up inspections, and then after that, each successive year, the number of inspections that federal OSHA conducted during the Obama administration declined pretty steadily. We did see, and so, surely you would think, well, the Trump administration, if anything, will just continue that decline, but instead we've seen them stem that tide and reverse and go in the other direction. In the first year of the Trump administration, they did conduct a few more inspections than they had done in the last year of the Obama administration, and that has climbed even more in 2019. I think it was about a 4% increase in inspections from 2019 over 2018, and so the trend seems to be doing even more enforcement inspections during this administration, not fewer, which is very surprising, just because of historical trends, but also what Amanda talked about. We're doing more inspections with a smaller workforce, so there does seem to be a serious commitment from the agency to sustain or even increase its inspection philosophy. The one thing we have seen, and I think we've experienced this anecdotally a little bit, is, and this makes sense just because of the math, it has to make sense. If there are many fewer inspectors and more inspections, well, guess what? The inspections are a little bit less deep than they were previously. So we have watched a trend of the man-hours, compliance officer man-hours per inspection declining. And I'm interested to see if that trend will continue as OSHA uses its increased budget and carries out what we know is a very active and very significant push to increase its compliance officer numbers right now. That's underway. So as those numbers climb up, will the man-hours per inspection climb up, or are we just going to continue to see maybe slightly more superficial inspections over the next, at least the next year or the next few years? But that's been an interesting trend to watch. The number of violations issued, similarly, just like inspections being conducted during the Obama administration, steadily trending down each year, and that trend down has more or less stabilized. The size of the drop each year has gotten to be very small. I mean, these are just around the edges, more or less at plateau at this point, and it'll be interesting to see as they ratchet up their number of compliance officers whether this is a similar trend that is reversed during the Trump administration, perhaps the opposite of what we would have expected, but it's at least stabilized from what we were seeing as steady annual declines in the number of violations issued in the second half of the Obama administration. Another really interesting data point here, and it's not interesting because of how it changes, it's interesting because of how steady it is and what it means. The top half of this slide shows the in-compliance rate, and these are the percentage of OSHA inspections that begin, are actually conducted, and are closed without a single citation issued. And that number has remained pretty steady in that 25% range. So about a quarter of OSHA citations go without citations, but that means 3/4 of OSHA citations result in at least one citation being issued. And then the bottom half of the slide shows that if a citation is going to be issued, it is almost a certainty it will be at least a serious violation. Almost 90% of OSHA citations are characterized as at least serious, which means serious, willful, or repeat violations. And those numbers are, barely changing during a Trump administration, showing this consistency of, if you get that knock on the door, it's really hard to avoid getting cited, and it's extremely hard to avoid getting cited for something at least characterized as serious. And this is one of the great frustrations if you've ever, had the media cover some enforcement action involving your company. They report on these things as though this company has this history of serious OSHA violations, but serious is so ubiquitous and is so, I think, mislabeled because virtually everything is at least serious that, it's one of the traps that, public perception accepts without really knowing this backstory here, the back data that I think is relevant to that kind of analysis. But it's interesting to see how steady that remains. Something that has not been steady, and again, might surprise you depending on what your expectations were about a Trump administration, is that the average penalty per violation has increased extraordinarily. We went from back at the beginning of the Obama administration that you saw an average of less than $1,000 per serious violation is now consistently up over $5,000 per serious violations. The maximum authority has gone up to about 13, so OSHA is not, obviously doesn't use that in every case. Small employers with good history, with good cooperation during the inspection and for various other factors get discounts from the maximum, but we're seeing that the discounts that employers are getting are not taking those penalties down to where they were during the prior Republican administration, and not even down to where they were during the Obama administration. They are quite a bit higher. So that trend is continuing to climb. The other, I would say, the most significant to me, eye-opening data point that I track as we cross years and cross administrations is what used to be called significant cases, $100,000 total penalties or more in a single enforcement action. If you would have told me that in the first year of a Trump administration that we would have seen OSHA set a record for the most ever significant enforcement actions, I would have said you were crazy, but that is exactly what happened, and they continue to hang out at those high levels. All 3 years of the Trump administration have been among the top 5 ever years in terms of significant enforcement actions, $100,000 penalty cases or more. The average for those $100,000 plus cases, and these would include the $1 million plus cases, which we're seeing more and more of these days as well, but an average of 188 $100,000 plus cases during the Trump administration as compared to 165 per year during the Obama administration, which was, a record compared to all prior administrations as well. So that trend of increasing those $100,000 cases has continued and, in fact, gone up during the Trump administration, contrary to what many of us would have expected. Enforcement press releases have also been a trend that have continued, I think, perhaps in the wrong direction during the Trump administration, although this is kind of a mixed bag. These are those really ugly press releases that get issued the same day that alleged violations are handed to you. The day that citations are issued, when all they are allegations, when you've had no opportunity to defend yourself or point out how wrong the citations might be, OSHA blasts out to the public a press release that during the Obama administration, 100% of those press releases included an inflammatory quote, an embarrassing quote from some OSHA or senior Department of Labor official blasting the company. And that was a new thing. You would rarely see those quotes in prior administrations. So during the Obama administration, we saw a significant increase in the number of press releases, and all of them had these really ugly quotes from somebody at the agency. During the Trump administration, one of the things we surely expected was that program would either stop, be scaled back significantly, the tone would return to being more black and white, factual statements about the citations. And what we did see was a decrease in the number of press releases, although it's still more than we saw during the Bush administration, but they continue. 100% of those press releases include nasty quotes from somebody at OSHA or the Department of Labor about the employer. So a mixed bag of what we've seen in the past, but not the change in policy, certainly that one might have expected as we moved into a Trump administration. So I'm going to hand it over to Micah to finish out the discussion about enforcement and keep things moving along.
Thanks, Eric. This is Micah Smith, and I'm a partner here in CMC's DC office, and I'll leave the rest of the introduction for another time. Let's continue here with the disappointments we've been feeling from this administration's OSHA. Looking specifically here at repeat violation policies, just like Eric was discussing there with enforcement press releases, we were anticipating some amount of change likely in terms of OSHA's repeat policies and how they used it. Historically, OSHA tended to treat workplaces as individual establishments. They had a short look back of 3 years, and they tended not to be aggressive in terms of enforcing repeats. So they didn't go out looking for repeat violations. Instead, they sat back. If they conducted an inspection and they came across a violation that could be classified as repeat, then they would take it, they would cite it, but they wouldn't go looking for them. Under the Obama administration, OSHA tried to shift their focus a little bit, be much more aggressive and proactive in terms of looking for repeat violations, expanded their look-back period, and started to look a little more broadly at the corporate family when they were trying to establish these repeat violations. So we expected that perhaps this administration would roll back some of the Obama administration's innovations, let's say, in terms of repeats. But as I noted, we've been rather sorely disappointed. In terms of the in terms of the look-back period, rather than changing the look-back from 5 years back to 3, they've left it completely unchanged. It sits in OSHA's FOM as a 5-year look-back as the guidance. Even worse than that is the fact that this administration litigated a case in which the Obama administration had gone beyond the 5-year look-back. They'd actually gone to 5.5 years or something like that. And the case was appealed, and this administration's solicitor's office argued the appeal. They briefed it. They had the opportunity to abandon the position and say, you know what, we're not going to argue in favor of an unlimited look-back. They didn't do that. They essentially argued that OSHA has the authority to look back at any period of time. The 3 or 5 year standard that they set in their guidance is just for their own guidance, and it isn't a limit on their authority. So that's OSHA ended up winning that case. So according to the courts, OSHA's 3 or 5 year look back period is not a limitation on them. So this, rather than going back to a softer stance on repeats, this administration actually continued expanding their ability to enforce repeats. I believe Eric already mentioned this. We were expecting that they might end certain emphasis programs, which would sort of slow down some of the looks at things that are high likelihood repeats. They have not retired those emphasis programs. We were also looking for maybe a change in the analysis of who can be the same employer in terms of a repeat citation. OSHA has, and OSHA has shifted to a successorship analysis, which we won't bore you with the details here, looking for some similarities. It's easier to establish that than it is under the old alter ego model. We thought this administration might try to shift back toward the alter ego model, and so far, no dice. There are some interesting words in a recent case from the Review Commission suggesting they're open to that, to kind of reining in this analysis on successorship, but so far OSHA is not playing ball with them on that. All right, if we look at the statistics, we've been showing this slide, or one similar to it, for a few years now, showing really the increase in the focus on repeat violations toward the end of the Obama administration. As we said before, we had expected that this administration might try to back off of that, but the statistics haven't borne that out. You can see while the raw number of serious violations have gone down, repeat violations have not gone nearly as much, and if you look at them as a percentage of the total violations issued, we're still at a very high number. If you look there at 2016 through 2019, those 4 columns on the right, if you squint, you can see that maybe they're dropping, that they're rolling back just a little bit. You know, I won't call it a trend yet, but really notably is the fact that at 4.8% of the total violations, we're at double what OSHA was doing in 2002, and it wasn't until nearly the end of the Obama administration that OSHA was citing repeats as this high percentage of their total number of citations. So, you know, the numbers might be taking a turn for the better, but so far, still disappointment in this realm for us. One bright spot in the area of repeat citations for the industry has been a case from OSHA called Angelica Textiles. We'll give you a real quick overview here of what it is and how it's a positive move. But it is an active case, one that we're going to be following over the next couple months. In Angelica Textiles, a company received citations back in, I think it's 2009, at one facility. About 5 years later, they received another set of citations in a different facility. OSHA classified those as repeats. When the case was argued, the employer argued that these violations were not substantially similar. There's no argument that it was the same employer, but they were looking at the violations from the first case and the second case, arguing that they weren't similar. And the basis of that is that the first citations were really involving wholesale deficiencies. So the company was required to have a confined space program and a lotto program, and they had really almost nothing at all. And so that was the nature of the violation from the first case. In the second case, the company had clearly gone out and established these programs, had seemed to do a pretty good job, had put forth at least a good faith effort to put in a wholesale program. But OSHA found minor violations, so small pieces that they thought were not consistent with the standards, and issued the citations. Well, because the citations in the first case were issued under the same subsections as in the second case, OSHA thought, well, here's your classic repeat case, same employer, same violation, same sections of the standard violated, so we'll issue these as a repeat. We've got here the Review Commission's standard for establishing repeat. That is one of the elements in the one issue here is, were the violations substantially similar? Of course, the employer argued they weren't. OSHA argued that they were. OSHA ruled that the violations were not substantially similar. In doing so, they really focused on a kind of a high-level analysis or a characterization of the conditions. So notable language from the decision was that the commission noted that they wouldn't use a mechanical application of the test for establishing a repeat characterization. The test that I referenced a minute ago, wherein OSHA looks at a previous violation, sees that there was, let's say, a violation under 1910-147C4. They look to see if that section was violated in the prior case. If they look in the current case and see that there's a violation under that same subsection, they tend to default toward a conclusion that these are repeat violations. OSHA very explicitly rejected that kind of what they called a mechanical application of the test. They looked fairly deep into the record to look at the evidence to see whether there was evidence to support OSHA's argument that the violations from the first case and the second case were substantially similar. And they really talked a lot about the changes that were made, the vast improvements, and in that way, they ruled that there was enough evidence put forward by the employer to rebut the presumption that violations issued under the same standard before, in the first case and the second case, were substantially similar. In dissent, Commissioner Atwood argued that the majority had introduced some new element into this determination, basically making up new law to get the conclusion that they want, and that all of these factors were completely irrelevant, that these things were substantially similar. This case was decided, I believe, in 2018, so it's been a little while now. It is currently on appeal to the Second Circuit now. We've been following this with some interest because there's been some very interesting procedural things happening in the case. The company, I believe, is going through a reorganization at the moment, so they have, this is not as, you don't have an active participant on the employer side. So OSHRIC's view is being defended by appointed counsel, and the oral arguments are scheduled for April of this year. So we will be watching this very closely, hoping to see the Second Circuit uphold the decision of OSHRIC, you know, that these companies, that there is an opportunity to show a lack of substantial similarity. So we'll keep you posted on that one through argument and when the decision is issued. Now we'll kick it over to Kate for a minute for a discussion of crimes.
Not high crimes and misdemeanors. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kate McMahon. I'd like to provide a brief update on the status of criminal prosecutions under the Trump administration to date and what we ought to expect for the final year of this administration. As Eric and Micah have both pointed out in the civil context, we are certainly seeing no backing off of criminal prosecutions for worker safety violations at all. And in fact, I think although the stats are meager, so it's difficult to develop trends, it looks like the Trump administration has been just as aggressive, if not more aggressive, in prosecuting crimes, bringing criminal prosecution actions for worker safety violations. We're seeing certainly at least status quo to what we saw under the Obama era. And I think most notably in our area of practice, what we wanted to share with you is both Attorney General Barr as well as Jeff Sessions before him continue to implement a set of policies developed under the Obama administration that are captured in two memoranda prepared by Sally Yates, who was the Deputy Attorney General under President Obama. And it's worth taking at least just a minute here to remind you all, because of the importance of this issue, of what these Yates policy memos establish. Yates 1, which was issued in September of 2015, establishes a policy of the Department of Justice to pursue individual prosecutions against individuals for corporate wrongdoing. And it imposes really rigid requirements that corporations turn over any and all evidence against any and all individuals allegedly involved in that misconduct, in order to receive any cooperation credit in the context of a criminal plea negotiation. So it really puts pressure on individuals to be prosecuted, and it provides a tool to the Department of Justice to gather information from the corporation in order to pursue those individual prosecutions. That was Yates 1. Yates 2, issued a few months later in December 2015, encourages the Department of Justice to rely on and use environmental statutes, where possible, to bring criminal charges against individuals for endangering workers, essentially for worker safety violations, to use criminal statutes rather than the OSHA Act in order to bring these criminal prosecutions. The reason for that is probably fairly obvious to any of you who have had to deal with this area or practice in this area, and it is because the OSHA Act itself is fairly feeble and limited in its criminal reach. You can only bring a criminal action under the OSHA Act in a very small set of circumstances, where there's a fatality and where there's a causal connection between that fatality and a willful violation of an OSHA regulation. So it's limited. The purpose of Yates 2 is to expand the universe of criminal prosecutions that can be brought by relying on the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, RCRA, CERCLA, other environmental statutes that, one, have a much, much more steep and severe penalty matrix, and two, have a much longer statute of limitations. The OSHA Act has a 6-month, very short statute of limitations. Most all of the major environmental statutes have at least a 5-year statute of limitations. So there's a longer period for the Department of Justice to gather evidence and bring a case. Those two memos remain in place and implemented by the agency. Rod Rosenstein in late 2018 did make some slight adjustments to the individual prosecution policy, and he kind of relaxed the requirement for corporations to provide evidence against any and all individuals involved in a crime, but it remains in place. So bottom line, on the criminal side, we're seeing just as many, if not more, prosecutions under criminal statutes, and they're very aggressive. Just looking back at over the last couple of months, we saw 2 fairly major criminal actions. One in Ohio, plant manager charged and sentenced to 3 months home confinement, 3 years probation, safety coordinator charged and sentenced to 5 months jail, weekend jail, and a $20,000 fine. This was for basically unstable stacking and racking at a facility where hot metal was stacked on these racks, fell over, and an employee was killed. So individual charges brought against both a plant manager and a corporate safety coordinator. So that's kind of what we wanted to share on the criminal front. If we go into another term of the Trump administration, we expect to see similar things. Now I'd like to turn it over to our partner Andrew Summers in California, who's going to talk about some developments on the Cal OSHA record-keeping front.
Thanks, Kate. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, excellent. This is Andrew Summer. I lead the Cal OSHA practice at the firm and defend California businesses and in Cal OSHA enforcement proceedings up and down the state, and also represent businesses in DOSH proceedings and state plans, including Oregon and Washington. But we're going to discuss a few Cal OSHA developments during this presentation. And, briefly, the first issue is the new extended statute of limitations for record keeping in California. It's quite a significant development. Assembly Bill 2334 took effect or was passed in 2018, was then effective 2019, and essentially retained the statute of limitations for all non-record keeping Cal OSHA citations. So sticking to the 6-month statute of limitations after the occurrence of the violation, which is similar to the Fed OSHA standard. But the real change here was the definition of an occurrence that would trigger the statute of limitations was modified for record-keeping purposes. And essentially, for record-keeping purposes, it's the violation is live and can lead to a citation as long as it hasn't been corrected, and the division, or until the division discovers the violation. Now, the effect here essentially is that in Cal 5-year retention period for the OSHA logs. And what that means is that as a continuing violation here, Cal OSHA can come in, ask for those 5 years of logs, and potentially cite you for violations involving any of those logs. And under Cal OSHA, there's also a duty to update the logs as you discover new information under specific circumstances. So we are likely to see more record-keeping violations cited in California as a result. One issue that's significant is per a Cal OSHA DOSH memorandum or guidance, there is the ability to cite violation by violation. So there is the potential here that Cal OSHA could come in, review the OSHA logs, and find multiple violations and attempt to cite penalties for each and every violation individually. So we're still seeing how this plays out, but as a result, it just reinforces in California the importance to ensure that the logs are reviewed periodically for accuracy. And this essentially reverts back to the kind of pre-Volz decision under Fed OSHA, making it so that there's this continuing violation through this 5-year retention period. And so I'm going to next turn it over to the next speaker on OSHA rulemaking deregulation.
Thanks, Andrew. This is Kate again. I want to talk at least briefly here about the status and future of OSHA rulemaking. I want to move us from enforcement to rulemaking and regulatory, what's going on in the regulatory world. That is an area of specialty of mine. You know, I could sum this up very quickly by saying what we already said. I think the bottom line is that we are not seeing what was expected to be seen on that fateful day in November after everyone woke up and learned that Donald Trump had become president. I think there was a great expectation on the industry side that essentially the administration would deconstruct, if you will, the administrative state. And the reason there was that expectation is because that is what the Trump campaign essentially promised to do. We had, you know, what is now, I think, an infamous statement by Steve Bannon, one of Trump's advisors, and early staff, high-level staff people, a person in the White House. We've had this slide, you know, that we've put in these various webinars for a number of years, but basically the message was, under this president, we are going to deconstruct the burdensome regulatory regime that has existed for many years and was propagated by the Obama administration. The promise was to, you know, basically get the federal government out of your workplace, to allow you to unburden you and allow you to make and build and sell things. They talked about moving jurisdiction from the federal government to states, you know, easing the burden essentially that was created under the Obama and Clinton administrations. However, what have we seen? The reality, essentially, you know, in some, I think we've seen the status quo. Maybe, perhaps, we could say a little sort of deregulatory light, because there has been some softening of the regulatory burden and obligations that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But essentially, nothing major, nothing dramatic, at least nothing permanent. One of the reasons that, you know, we would expect that that's the case is because unlike at EPA, where Scott Pruitt and now Andrew Wheeler were and are in charge, or at Interior, where you know, Ryan Zinke was in charge, at the Department of Labor, and in particular at OSHA, there has not been a Trump appointee, a true Trump appointee leading that department or agency. As we talked about, as Amanda talked about earlier, we now have our second Secretary of Labor, but Gene Scalia and Alex Acosta before him are both lawyers. They're both longtime practitioners, and they both understand that you can't just snap your fingers and deregulate, get rid of regulations. You know, the agency was to be led by a guy, if you all remember, a guy named Andy Puzder, who was the CEO of Hardee's and a good buddy of Trump's. And had we had an Andy Puzder at the head of labor, we might have seen the course taken at EPA or Interior, for instance, but that's not what we've seen. So let's talk about what the reality is and what have we seen. There were, you know, at the outset, some early actions that impacted our world, the health and safety world, that had a fairly dramatic impact, and it was maybe a sign that things really were going to change. But those actions were actually taken by Congress rather than OSHA or the Department of Labor. Probably the two biggest, most impactful deregulatory acts were, one, the Congressional Review Act action that eliminated the Volks rule that was promulgated under the Obama administration, the Volks rule being the rule that essentially made the statute of limitations move from a 6-month statute of limitations, which is the OSHA Act statute, to 5 years by establishing that record-keeping violations were continuing violations, and Micah talked some about this. In any case, OSHA promulgated the Volks rule in order to have a regulation that established that 5-year statute of limitations. One of the first actions out of the box by Congress in March of 2017 was to CRA, to get rid of that rule by Congressional Review Act. They also got rid of the FAR rule that had an impact on government contractors, but we don't have time to go into that here. Also, of course, there were two major executive orders that were issued early on in the administration, in that first spring of the Trump administration, that essentially mandated this 2-for-1 concept, whereby for each agency, every rule that they promulgated, they had to get rid of 2 in order to lessen the burden. That executive order has never really taken hold, at least in our world, at OSHA and at the Department of Labor. We've not seen that implemented, at least in any obvious way. And then there were some soft acts, some modest scaling back, e-record keeping rule, which we're going to talk about in just a second, and some slowdown of the rulemaking agenda. If you look at, you know, as I do, follow the regulatory agenda from season to season, we saw some items that we thought might have moved if there had been a Hillary Clinton administration, like revision to the PSM standard, a new combustible dust standard, a new workplace violence standard, some major expansion of the Lotto rule. None of those have happened, and most of them have been moved to long-term actions. So there's been some softening, and in particular we want to talk about the scaling back of the e-record keeping rule, where it was scaled back and where it was not scaled back. And I'm going to hand the mic back to Micah to talk about that.
So this was an example of fairly successful rollback, at least in some ways. If you recall, in 2016, OSHA had promulgated a new rule related to the electronic submission of record-keeping data, along with some other record-keeping related things. It was a fairly big change in the rules that everyone found rather burdensome. It was particularly concerning because the 2016 rule would require most employers, large employers or smaller employers in higher hazard industries, to submit a lot of data, not just, now this was all data that was being collected in terms of the 300 logs and the 301 incident reports, but never before had this information ever been submitted to the agency wholesale. And so this rule seemed to track with David Michael's goal of gathering more information to try to confirm, you know, his suspicions that there were a lot more bad things happening out there that OSHA just wasn't aware of, and that they could use the data to go out and either make new standards or to go do more enforcement. So that was promulgated in 2016. There was a lot of litigation around this, a lot of discussion, and after a long rulemaking process and a lot of interim delays of the requirements to submit e-record keeping data, OSHA issued their NPRM in July 2018, and then finalized it last January. And they eliminated most of the submission requirements. With this rollback done, what we're left with is employers are required to submit their 300 A's on an annual basis. That's, if you're familiar with that, it's a fairly sterile reporting. There's some numbers there, but they're aggregated. There aren't a lot of details about specific cases, and so it's a lot less burdensome, a lot less concerning about the fact that the agency will have all this information. So that's a successful rollback for employers. What this rollback did not touch, that we reference here, is that it did not address the issue of OSHA publishing data that they do receive, whether they can do that, how they can do that. It also didn't touch any of the anti-retaliation policies that OSHA had moved forward on in the at the tail end of the Obama administration. So this rulemaking did not touch the issues related to drug testing, safety incentives, bonuses, et cetera. There has been a little bit of development, soft development in terms of guidance documents, but nothing that's been significant enough that we wanted to touch it here. So we'll call that a moderate rollback, and I'll kick it back to Andrew for a discussion on the Cal OSHA injury reporting.
All right, thank you, Micah. This year, Cal OSHA has, or the California legislature has, amended the definition of serious injury or illness for reporting purposes, and it has largely been aligned with the Fed OSHA standard now, which is helpful to a degree for businesses with nationwide operations, but there are some significant differences in California, one of which relates to the obligation to report immediately, which is defined essentially in most circumstances as within 8 hours of actual constructive knowledge of the serious injury or illness, as opposed to the 24 hours under the Fed OSHA reporting standard. And under existing law or prior law, the serious injury or illness was defined as an injury or illness occurring in the place of employment or in connection with employment, which is a bit broad and can include a number of different circumstances. And it's circumstances that require inpatient hospitalization for treatment that was for more than 24 hours, or for an injury that results in a loss of a member of the body or a serious degree of permanent disfigurement. And the rule, like Fed OSHA, excluded any accidents occurring on public roads or highways, but did not contain the exception for construction zones, that, as was under the Fed OSHA standard. Now, the legislature passed Assembly Bill 1805 that then revised the standard, and essentially, under the next slide, it talks about the various elements that changed, and one of which relates to the 24-hour minimum inpatient hospitalization stay. That no longer is an element, and the reporting is simply triggered in the case of inpatient hospitalization just by the virtue of that hospitalization. Also, the term loss of member was changed to amputation to align with the federal standard. And loss of an eye was added as a triggering element under the standard. And as I think I was indicating, the reporting standard still excludes accidents on public highways or public roads. It does now exclude construction zones. So the one 48 hours of a fatality or serious injury or illness. And also California makes clear that there's an obligation to inquire into the status of the employee's condition. So there can be an obligation report based on the actual or constructive notice. And so essentially you either knew whether it was a serious injury or illness, or you should have known that it was a serious injury or illness based on what a reasonable employer would do in inquiring into the status of the employee's condition following the accident. And California's pretty rigorous in enforcing reporting violations, and so it's important just to keep track of the standard as you move forward in doing business in California. And then I'll turn it over to the discussion on Lotto.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll go in reverse for these slides here, kind of talking about the keeping in the theme of the regulatory rollback. One minor, it's not exactly a rollback, but we'll call it a quick stop or a halt of something that had been started under the previous administration, relates to a change in the Lotto rule related to the language of unexpected energization. Under the Standards Improvement Project, the fourth episode of this particular show, OSHA had, in framing this as a way to make the standard clearer, not to make a big change, but to just make clear what the standard was supposed to mean, they suggested that they might remove from the Lotto rule the phrase unexpected energization to undo the DC Circuit's decision from the GM Delco case a number of years ago. This, of course, if you've heard us talk about it, it would not be a minor change in the language to make things clearer. It would be an absolute change in the meaning of the standard. So this was something we've been watching with great concern, watching this administration push forward with the SIP4 rulemaking, and then fortunately in the final rule they pulled this particular change. It went forward, the other standards were updated, but this change was not made in the Lotto standard. So we were very gratified to see that this did not change. But at the same time, in the rulemaking, OSHA made some statements that made clear that they could consider in the future making a similar change, right? They acknowledged that this wasn't the right place to do it, but that they are still sitting on this and considering possible changes in the future. So this was, the timing of this is really interesting when you compare it to our next slide. So you'll notice that the final rule was published in on May 13th, 2019. And so this is where the language here at the bottom of this slide came from. OSHA saying, hey, we'll consider this in the future. Well, a week later, OSHA issued a request for information related to Lockout Tagout. I'm no conspiracy theorist, but I have a hard time reading two apparently connected events happening so close in time without drawing some connection between them. Now, the focus of this RFI was not unexpected energization per se. It was, however, related to some changes in, or what could be changes in OSHA's view of what's acceptable under Lockout Tagout. Historically, OSHA has only accepted as valid de-energization a full disconnect of energy. So we need to see there being no metal between the two conducting parts, right? You can throw a switch. You have to do something where there is no physical way for the electricity or for the energy to pass into the machine that is de-energized. That's been their standard for a long time. However, given technological developments and the new world that we're living in, no longer are we, is this a simple place where one person can walk over, throw a switch, and lock out that switch. Given these technological changes, we now see computers controlling things. We now see integrated circuits. We see robots being used in the workplace a lot more often. While there's typically always some way to do a hard de-energization, right, to just pull the plug or have a full disconnect. That can be very, very difficult, very time-consuming, given the amount of automation that's out there. So OSHA issued this request for information, asking industries to answer some questions related to how it might be feasible to change the baseline for lockout tagout, so that instead of requiring this hard disconnect, where there might be occasions where control circuit technology could be used to provide a safe lockout as opposed to the old version. There were a number of comments submitted. I believe the deadline was toward the end of last summer. OSHA has not taken any steps that we have seen with those yet. So as far as we can tell, the information is still under consideration. So this is something that we'll be watching very closely to see what kind of action the agency will take or won't take. This could be a good opportunity for a change to the Lotto rule that would be very beneficial to employers, that would allow some creativity in terms of lockout while protecting employee safety, to allow some new reliable methods to be used for lockout tagout. At the same time, I'm suspicious that if they take the next step and do a proposed rule, there might be an effort to sneak in that removal of unexpected energization that was at issue in SIP 4. So we will be keeping close tabs on this as we go forward. And with that, we'll go back to Kate for Silica.
All right, just a word or two on Silica. And we're talking about this really because Silica itself is ubiquitous, as you will probably all know, and the rule itself has a far reach and impacts probably many of you on the telephone. So just a couple of important things to keep in mind. One, probably the most important update or reminder, I guess, to share with all of you is that we have this coming spring, June 23rd, 2020, a change in the rule. As the rule was promulgated, there were milestones that were set for effectiveness, and one of the transitions that was set up for compliance in the standard was to move the medical surveillance provision of the standard to a broader coverage. So as written right now, medical surveillance applies to those employees who have exposures above the PAL of 50 micrograms per meter cubed over a 30-day period in a year. However, as of June 23rd, 2020, that coverage will be expanded to cover any worker who has exposures above the action level of 25 micrograms per meter cubed. So the change in this coming spring is going to broaden the scope of coverage for medical surveillance. So just a reminder on that. Second thing is also just sort of a reminder, and it's based on compliance work that we do every day on this rule, and that is a reminder to document your objective data that you have if you have made a determination that the Silica rule does not apply to you. It would not apply to you if you can demonstrate essentially that you do not have exposures above the action level under any foreseeable circumstances. However, the agency has brought enforcement actions where a company who is not complying with the Silica rule doesn't believe it impacts them, but has no objective data to demonstrate that, and there is, silica at the workplace. And remember, silica at the workplace can be silica in the soil at your workplace. So the scope of the standard is broad. If you've made the determination that you are not covered, make sure to document the objective data upon which you're relying for that determination. Third and final thing I want to share with you about Silica is something we've shared in other webinars last year, and that is the work that OSHA is doing right now, considering an expansion of the Table 1 provision in the construction Silica standard. The construction standard has established a table that allows for that eases essentially the burden of compliance if you can meet the requirements of Table 1. Essentially what Table 1 does is it identifies common construction tasks and activities, and it matches those with control technologies and methods that work and have been shown to be effective. If you have one of those, if you're doing one of those tasks at a site that is covered by the construction standard, and you are implementing the control technology that is identified in Table 1, you don't have to worry about enforcement of the Pell. It is assumed that you will meet the Pell if you have implemented the control technology identified in Table 1 for the construction task associated therewith. You also don't have to do monitoring of your employees to assess and gather information about exposures. So it's a nice, I like the way OSHA has done this, and I think it's a good way to ensure that we're keeping exposures low for tasks where we already have data established by, many different firms that have silica exposures over the years. OSHA's taken that and effectively developed this table. What OSHA is considering doing is expanding the table. They issued last December an RFI requesting information on essentially two things. One, are there other control measures that could be and are effective in implementing and reducing exposures associated with the construction tasks already identified in Table 1? So are there other ways to skin the cat that work effectively to control measures? Second, are there other tasks for which we know already the control methods that are effective that ought to be included in Table 1? Now, the time period is closed on the RFI. However, I know that OSHA often will consider information that is submitted late. So if you're dealing with the Silica rule in a construction setting, think about whether there are tasks that might meet the Table 1 structure. And I would encourage you to submit that information to OSHA for consideration. I know they're still evaluating whether and how they're going to update Table 1. All right, now we're coming to the very close of the time we have allotted to complete this webinar. So let me just identify a couple of things here at the end and then turn it over to Andrew for last word. Some guidance documents. These two executive orders, not guidance documents, excuse me, two new executive orders that were issued last October by the President. These could be, sort of sea change game changers, but all remains to be seen. Nothing has been implemented yet, so we don't know where they're going to go. They may go the way of the 2-for-1 regulatory action, where not much really has been done under 2-for-1 in our little area of the world. But I want to tell you about them because they really could be impactful. I think realistically they probably won't be in this last year of Trump's term. If he is reelected, they could become very significant. Very briefly, October 9th, 2019, the President issued two new executive orders, the titles of which are listed on this slide in front of you. The whole purpose of these executive orders is essentially to ensure that laws that companies have to comply with are known by those companies and that they are actually promulgated pursuant to the administrative process that applies, essentially the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act. The first executive order, 13891, does a number of important things, and I think these are good. If these things are actually implemented, these would be generally good developments. Basically, the Executive Order 13891 requires the publication of all guidance documents by an agency on a single searchable database. I'm sure you, as the regulated community, know how frustrating and difficult it is to figure out what 16 words in a regulation mean when there are 16,000 words that have been written in guidance documents, letters of interpretation, enforcement memos, et cetera, about what those 16 words mean. But you need to hire a lawyer to figure out what they mean. This rule will make it a lot easier for everyone to go to a database for OSHA and find all of the guidance that has been issued on, say, lotto, a lotto machine-specific procedure requirement or the like. Second, the requirement or the executive order asks that there be a full review of guidance documents that exist right now and a rescission of any of those that are no longer, should no longer be in effect. So there's a request to the agency to look hard at what you've already issued and pull some back. Develop regulations for the process of issuing guidance documents and follow notice and comment rulemaking in almost all cases, and seek public input before publishing guidance documents. So engage with the regulated community and interested stakeholders in development of guidance. That's the first executive order. The second executive order, 13892, focuses on enforcement and fairness and transparency in enforcement of agency regulations. This one's pretty dramatic. This executive order says that you can only enforce standards that are public and would not cause unfair surprise. So if you are enforcing a regulation that is essentially filled out by guidance documents and those guidance documents have not been promulgated or published in the Federal Register, then essentially you can't rely on those guidance documents to enforce the standard. It requires for the publication of any new or potential expanded jurisdiction. This ag retailers is a perfect example where OSHA really did expand fairly dramatically the scope of the language of what was intended under the PSM standard. And this executive order will prohibit that sort of activity. The guidance has got to be published in advance in the Federal Register or on this new, one searchable database that will exist under 13891. The executive order also requires making procedures to encourage voluntary self-reporting in exchange for lower penalties. That'll be interesting. There's been no guidance that's been issued by OMB to tell us what exactly that means, but it's an interesting concept. Adherence to the Paperwork Reduction Act when requesting information without a formal subpoena. So in the context of a citation and enforcement issue, when you get a request for information from the COSHO for, your logs and all your policies and training records, et cetera, this is a reminder that you, as the agency, have got to comply with the Paperwork Reduction Act in your request for this information. And finally, and this one is a real game changer if it ever comes to be something, it states that the regulated community has got to have an opportunity in advance to contest agencies' noncompliance determinations. So in the context of OSHA, what this seems to say is that prior to the issuance of an OSHA citation, the agency has got to notice the company that will be cited and give them opportunity before issuance of the citation to weigh in, provide their argument, and the agency has got to respond to that. Now, is that simply what we do now in closing conferences? I don't know. These executive orders direct OMB to issue guidance documents to implement the policies that are established under these executive orders, and then provide the agencies that will be impacted by these orders about 4 to 6 months to essentially do what the orders say to do. But until the OMB issues guidance, those obligations are not triggered. So nothing really has to happen right now, and nothing I am almost certain will happen right now with these. We'll see what happens in the next year if the president is not impeached and then is reelected. All right. The Chemical Safety Board, a development we want to share with you that's pretty important for a number of you on the telephone today, we think, and for a large segment of the regulated community. The Chemical Safety Board, this slide provides sort of a history, but in light of the time, let me jump to the chase. The agency, December 12th, just a few weeks ago, issued a notice of proposed rulemaking requiring owners and operators to report to the CSB any release, any accidental release into the ambient air that resulted in a fatality, a serious injury, or substantial property damage. Now, this rule was required to be promulgated pursuant to the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. So CSB has, for essentially 30 years, been required to promulgate this rule. It had not done so. It had taken essentially no action, except in 2009, it did issue a notice of advanced rulemaking that basically was an RFI, gathering information, but then this lay dormant for another 10 years and nothing happened. The agency was sued for failure to promulgate this rule that is required to be promulgated by the Clean Air Act, and the court decision that was issued in February of 2018, a year ago, February 2019, sorry, gave the agency 12 months to issue the final rule. So the agency has until February 5th to issue this rule. The proposal just came out December 12th. We, representing a number of industries that could be impacted by this rule, provided comment on the rule. There are some very serious concerns about the rule. We've sort of summarized some of the main concerns we've got here. More to come on this. I feel certain that the rule is going to be promulgated as proposed because the agency had zero time to review the very serious issues raised to the agency's attention by the comments, not only ours, but others in the regulated community, and address those comments, contemplate those comments, reflect on those comments, and revise the rule accordingly. So we're going to see on February 5th a new final rule that will apply to anyone who has an accidental release into the ambient air that results in a serious injury, a fatality or property damage equaling $1 million. Guess what, folks? Serious injury is defined in a way in this rule, and I don't even know if the CSB realized this or whether it was intentional, but it is defined in a way that captures injuries that would not even meet the threshold for being recordable on an OSHA 300 log. Surely that was not what was meant, or shouldn't be what was meant, but that is what this rule says. So many of you will be captured in this. Please be aware of it. There'll be an opportunity to challenge the rule legally if it is in fact promulgated as proposed, and reach out to us to get a better understanding of the rule and its impact if you would like. Note the various concerns that we've identified here on this slide. Okay, a final topic. I'm going to turn it back over to Andrew to conclude our webinar. Our first webinar of our year-long series to talk about Cal OSHA Workplace Violence Rule applicable to general industry. Andrew?
Thank you, Kate. I'll be brief. Actually, the proposed workplace violence general industry rule has not yet gone into effect. We will cover this in greater detail during our Cal OSHA webinar that our firm will be conducting later in the year. But just in a nutshell, California has a workplace violence in healthcare rule, and that has been in effect for some time. There is a drive to develop a general industry workplace violence rule. There has been a rule that has been proposed, has been commented upon, and we do expect a formal rule to issue soon, and we'll cover that or at least blog on it when it does issue. And then if someone could click down to the next slide, we also are going to cover indoor heat illness rule. That's another rule that I think we can defer given the limited time here for our Cal OSHA webinar. We do in California have an outdoor heat illness rule that with rigorous requirements for training and for policy documents and implementation in high heat conditions. But this rule is designed to apply to indoor workplaces where the temperature exceeds a certain threshold. This rule is still in the works, just like the general industry workplace violence rule, and we will be reporting on this when the rule does issue. And then the last issue on the next slide concerns the rule that actually has taken effect, that's concerning wildfire smoke. And given the historic levels of wildfire incidences in the state, California has adopted an emergency regulation, and a permanent regulation will issue concerning the handling of wildfire smoke from these fires. And the rule has several components. Just briefly, there is an exemption under the rule for a workplace that is indoors, where there is no opening to the outside. You know, the doors are closed, the windows are closed, and there's and the air is filtered. In those circumstances, you may have an exemption. And there's also other circumstances where the employer can demonstrate that the air concentrations are below a certain threshold. And what's relevant here is the air quality index. It can be reported, or it can be something monitored by the employer. The gist of it is, if the standard does apply to your workplace, there are a few things that are required here. There's training and instruction that's required of employees. There's also an obligation to monitor the workplace for the air quality levels, the air quality index, and that can be through what is forecasted or what is actually being detected and monitored in the workplace. And then you must communicate with employees regarding the wildfire smoke hazards. What are a couple key considerations here is, one, if you are at a threshold of an air quality index of 151 or greater, you have a requirement to implement certain engineering controls, and those engineering controls can be involved, can relate to, for example, just enclosing the facility, keeping the doors closed, the windows closed, can involve filtering the air. And where those engineering controls are not adequate, then you're expected to follow administrative controls, which may involve relocating work to a location where the air quality is below a certain threshold, changing work schedules, reducing work intensity, giving additional breaks. And then if the air quality index is, if it's over 500, then you're required to provide respirators. So it will be important, or is already important, for California employers to have policies in place regarding wildfire incidences and how to handle the smoke in the workplace. And if you have this policy in effect, you may be able to meet the exemption. And then if you can't meet the exemption, you need to make sure that you've gone through the steps that are required, given that the rule would apply to your workplace. And with that, we are concluding the presentation.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks to my whole team, and thanks to all of you for bearing with us as we get familiar with our new webinar platform. We will hopefully work out some of the audio issues and slide issues for our program next month. And thanks certainly for sticking with us for our feature-length film. We'll do better for the individual topics over the rest of the year, keeping those to no more than an hour and 15 minutes. It's hard when you get all of the partners together. We like to talk a lot, so our apologies for the duration. Check out our blog, check out the rest of the webinar series, and plan to join us for the rest of the programs. Here's the schedule. You can find it on our website or on the blog. We were trying to address questions as they came in through the chat function. Because we've run long here, I would say if you do have a question that was not addressed, please shoot any one of us an email or give us a call, and we're happy to talk through that offline with you, and we hope to see you very soon. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.